Hello there, it's Antrice, and welcome to another episode of the Savvy Painter podcast. This episode is sponsored by Trekell Art Supplies. For over 30 years, Trekell has been obsessed with the art of brush making, and now they're applying that same obsession to professional-grade artist panels. Both their brushes and panels are made right here in California at their Hesperia factory. Jason Cytacki is my guest this week. Jason is an artist living in Oklahoma, where he teaches painting at the University of Oklahoma. Jason's paintings reflect his interest in Western art and our perception of the American West, which is so heavily influenced by the Western movie genre. His series on cowboys, titled Don't Fence Me In, plays with the archetypal image of the cowboy as experienced both through the eyes of adults and pre-adolescent boys. So a friend of mine, Jen Malone, brought Jason to my attention. Jen had seen an exhibition of his work at the South Bend Art Museum in Indiana. Now, Jen will be the first to admit that she is not particularly into art. But when she wandered into Jason's exhibition, which included paintings from his series See the USA, his work spoke to her, and she emailed me about him. For his series See the USA, Jason constructed miniature dioramas of Western landscape out of cardboard and then meticulously rendered the minute details as an oil painting. In this episode, Jason and I talk about his painting, why he chooses his motifs, his experience with artist block, and how he overcame it. Plus, how hard work and persistence has really paid off for him. So without further ado, here is Jason Cytacki. Jason, thank you so much for being on the Savvy Painter podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got started as an artist? I know you have kind of an academic background, but I'm curious, what were some of the things that you were thinking about when you graduated?
Well, how I got started as an artist, I would say began much earlier than college. When I was a kid, I loved comic books, and my first introduction to art was through like comic books and cartoons and more popular culture kind of things, applications of arts. But it wasn't until college where I really started being interested in the fine arts side of those pursuits. I lived in Indiana, close to Chicago, so that was a really great sort of resource in that I was able to take a train and go up to the Art Institute, see some fantastic works of art, and thanks to great teachers and professors in college that kind of helped steer me and guide me. And then I think it kind of, when I started thinking about when I was graduating, what I wanted to accomplish, they didn't necessarily have a very clear idea when I was graduating from my undergraduate degree. I just kind of foolishly kind of thought that you just graduated and made art, and it was like, oh yeah, that's what you do,
right? And
so I feel like I was somewhat unprepared in that aspect, and no fault to my teachers at all. I just had pie in the sky ideas about what being an artist was, and the very romantic sense of it.
What were you expecting when you graduated?
I don't know. Like, I just assumed that I would get some kind of a job and then make my art on the, while I wasn't working, and it would, I'd have plenty of time, and this kind of bohemian idea that I think a lot of people have about what a painter is or an artist is. And so, I did that for, I guess, a few months. I worked as a framer, and I started showing at a gallery in town. And it wasn't until I had an opening one day, the gallery owner said, "Oh, you should go talk to this person. They run the graduate program at this other school, and you should look into an MFA and go to school. Continue."
Oh, really?
And I was like, "Oh, I guess I could think about that." Then it's like, "Oh, I really need to do that." And so that was I feel like one of those pivotal moments that if that happenstance conversation hadn't happened, I probably would have ended up in a slightly different direction.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So that person from the MFA program just happened to be in the gallery, and the gallery owner was like, "Hey, go talk to him." Was there any, like, did the gallery owner talk to you, like, later talk to you about it and tell you why he thought that? Or was it just a kind of a passing?
Yeah, well, we went up and talked to her. He brought me over to her and said, "Oh, this is Maria Tomasula. She teaches painting at the University of Notre Dame. This Jason here is a great young lad, and I think he'd be great for your program." And we kind of exchanged formalities of, "Oh yeah, I'll send you an email," and then I ended up after that really starting to really consider and think about graduate school, and I applied to a lot of places, but then I enjoyed what I had experienced thinking and the conversation I had with that teacher, and decided to pursue it there. So it was kind of happenstance, but it worked out in a positive way.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember, like at that time, how you thought about, I mean, I know how you thought about your art. Like, I know you just said that you feel like, now in retrospect, you were a little bit naive with the romantic vision of it, but I'm curious how the program that you went to get your MFA, if that changed your thought process at all.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I feel like I don't feel like I was alone in that, in my early thoughts about painting, and I really focused on the technical side of things. And I mean, I still enjoy the technical side of painting and really love pushing paint around and looking at old masters and thinking, how did they do this? And how do I love going to the bookstores and getting those like technique books, like the really, terrible ones, like how to paint cats in 6 easy steps. Like a junkie for that kind of technical stuff.
It's like crack for artists, I think. It's like Bob Ross is so mesmerizing. You can't, like when he's on, it's just like, boom, your eyes just go right there and just can't stop watching.
It's like the ramen noodles. It's like, I know this is not great food, but gosh, it's entertaining and I love it. But yeah, I felt like I was very engaged in the technical side of things. And, there's that whole period I feel like most artists have where there's a skill acquisition where you're like really pushing yourself to get better and better. And that's sort of where I was when I started my MFA program. And then I was introduced to all these other ideas and different types of artists and sculptors and video artists, installation artists, people that I had no knowledge of prior. And it really kind of just expanded my horizons as to seeing myself within the larger picture of what is possible. And also even just within painting what's possible, that, painting could be really technically and aesthetically fantastic, but could also be conceptual. It could be intelligent. It could be funny. It could be emotional. It could be so many different things that I hadn't really explored. So it was really a period of a lot of artistic development and personal development. I look back and really am happy with, at the time, it was a stressful period of time, obviously, but look back and I think that it was some good things I was being exposed to. And I think I look and see those things more naturally a part of who I am as an artist these days that I would have thought at that time.
Right, right. It sounds like you were asking yourself some pretty deep questions and exploring these things. But so now, how would you answer that question now? Like, who is Jason Cytacki as the artist?
Well, I like to, hopefully, I think of myself as, a visual artist. I try and find a balance between concept and practice. I mean, there's a part of the whole process that I think there's like 2 parts of the process that I get really excited about. One is the actual like making the painting and playing with all of the layers and, coming up with challenges for myself in that regard. It's like, oh, it'd be great to paint this. That sounds super fun. But there's the other aspect that's thinking of these ideas and trying to communicate ideas and finding connections between different things I'm thinking about. I think I'm most happy when I can engage with both of those aspects of making. If it's purely formal, I'm just doing an exercise, a demonstration for my students, it's rewarding in a certain sense. In the same way, I don't think I could be a completely conceptual artist who isn't an object maker, because I just, there's something about working with your hands and creating things that especially visual things that I enjoy so much.
When you're painting now, what are some of your biggest challenges, like when you're facing the canvas?
The number one is always what to paint. Deciding. It's never like, I have no idea which I should paint. It's like, which one of these things do I paint? But besides that, I was thinking about trying to, like I said, set up challenges for myself to make it interesting throughout the whole process of painting. When I first learned painting in undergrad, oil painting, we did a lot of observational painting from still lifes and from models, which, to this day, I think is so valuable. But as I have done that, for a number of years, especially doing a series I did where I was like painting like cardboard, these like cardboard landscapes, and
yeah,
really fun, and I loved it. But by the time I got to the 40th or 50th hour working on it, it becomes somewhat of just a task of labor of completing a project. And so I think since that time I've grown and trying to add complexity to how I think about paintings, instead of painting in necessarily just one sort of manner, but to build in, some element of chance or uncertainty into the process where I can engage with, more gestural marks, in that 40th or 50th hour.
Right.
Or I'm not really sure what's going to happen in this area, but I'm excited to find out, much farther down the road.
Can you give an example of how you do that? So if you're in the 40th or 50th hour, what is happening on your canvas at that point, and how do you inject chance into it?
Yeah, so the most recent paintings I've completed, I've actually going back to drawing a lot. I've been doing a drawing and then working from a drawing. So I'm inventing some of the spaces that my figures are existing in. But I have tried to not complete every little square of the canvas, and that, okay, I know the figure is going to go here. I have a reference I'm going to use for this, and I want this motion to go this way. But because I'm working from a drawing and some, reference photos I've taken, that color is, another variable that I'm playing with. And so oftentimes when I get to that point in the canvas, it needs that thing to make it make sense or work. So it's like, oh, well, maybe I need to add another little path over here, or maybe there needs to be, I need some bright yellow over here. What can I put over there that's yellow that makes sense within the logic of this painting? And so within that, trying to give myself the opportunity that I can still play with composition and mark making even at that stage. And, as I found as doing this, it's a balancing act of being prepared, but also allowing some spontaneity into the mix.
Right. Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about, because your work, like the work that I saw of yours first, just real quickly, I'll tell you how I found you, Jason. Yeah. And it's actually kind of interesting because normally the artists I interview are either artists that I'm really interested in talking to. I kind of vary it up on purpose. It's artists that I'm interested in talking to, or people that a past guest have recommended, or it is a recommendation from listeners of the podcast. But in this particular case, it was a friend of mine who said to me, we know each other outside of the art world, more on the business level. And so she said to me, I don't understand art, and normally I don't like it. But there's this guy, Jason Cytacki, I can't say your last name, Jason Cytacki. I saw his work and I absolutely loved it. So I'd love it if you would interview him. And just because, she sort of prefaces it with that she normally does not like art. She's not interested in art at all, but your work spoke to her. And the work that she described to me was the work that you were doing with the cardboard cutouts.
Interesting.
Yeah, isn't it?
Serendipitous. I'll take it.
Right. But I think it's so fast. I mean, I love it when somebody says, I don't like this except for X. And then it always grabs my attention. I'm like, ooh, why? What's going on? What is it about that attracts you? Could you talk a little bit about that series and how you came up with that concept and what you were exploring?
Yeah, for certain. Those works, I've done a number of those, and they're really fun to make. A lot of the paintings I had done right before that series involved toys. I, for some reason, have a lot of my toys from when I grew up and have always enjoyed. Okay, so let me go back. I really enjoy a lot of narrative type quality paintings, historically, the old masters' works of these religious or mythological narratives. And, for some reason I stumbled upon this idea. I was like, oh, it's really funny if I did that with, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man and He-Man or something. And so, it's sometimes these ideas start at a really simple place and then kind of grow. And I feel like I still do that today, where there's that initial lightning bolt of an idea that sometimes could be dismissed as being just silly or stupid. And then, I think about it and analyze it and go farther and farther. And then it comes to something that's much more interesting. I feel like that's where these landscapes kind of came from, because the figures I was painting, these toys, started to have environments that they were in, of forests or whatever. And I was making these little, almost like a stage set that you would go see a high school play. And, there's the background that's like a big cutout or a curtain of like a tree. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to do those sans the figures. And going along with that, one of my main areas of interest on an idea or subject level is the ways in which we view ourselves in relation to our environment and to all these sort of external influences that we encounter in the world. And I grew up watching a lot of Westerns and Western movies. And, I kept thinking how these Western landscapes have so much symbolic meaning to who we are as Americans, how we identify ourselves. And I mean, growing up in Indiana, it wasn't like I would walk out the door and see grand mountain ranges, but I knew about those because I watched a lot of movies. I saw cartoons. I feel like it's something that transcended geography, because as Americans, even, people around the world know this as, hey, this is American stuff. So I was really interested in those ideas. And it's one of those things where these ideas sort of collide and things start to click. And it seemed like I could play with kind of the construction of these ideas, because, of course, these landscapes are real places, but they're also somewhat invented on an ideological level or even on a literal level. Like these painters that would go out to the West and then come back with sketches and then paint these like mammoth canvases where there's like, these great effects of like there's a sunset and there's like just the perfect amount of deer in the corner with like an eagle flying over. Like, so like just playing with this level of the inventedness of these ideas and how that affects us on different levels, but never want to be too like overt and hit people over the head with it. So I tried to leave it kind of ambiguous and playful that could be enjoyed at multiple levels.
Right. For me, at least, it just reminds me so much of childhood and that sense of adventure and building your own little maquettes or whatever. Like I used to be sort of, I guess, kind of a tomboy or whatever. Like there was all these adventure books that I loved. And so I always had this imagination about the West and living off of the land and, all this stuff. So it sort of reminds me of like a cross between that and, I don't know, like I think every grade school has their students do this, but at some point you have to build like the cereal box.
Oh yeah, or the shoe box.
Yes.
Definitely.
It totally reminds me of that, but on a much more sophisticated level, obviously. But they're immediately like catch your attention and they're familiar and they're intriguing and somehow foreign. So like they're really, really cool. As you sort of described it, you sometimes have a hard time, like you've got like all these ideas and deciding what to paint or what to tackle. So when you make the choice, what is it that fascinates you and makes you go, okay, that's the thing that I want to play with for now?
Yeah, I think it varies project to project. I tend to like to work in a series, and develop an idea. So I constantly always tell my students this too, that the next idea for a painting usually comes from the previous one, and that there's something about that previous project that I found really interesting that happened in the process. And I take it, like, oh yeah, I want to play with that more. I mean, sometimes it's a color, sometimes it's a subject, sometimes it's a certain figure, or like, oh, I really liked how this worked. I really want to just do a whole painting of just that certain area. Like I want to zoom in and play with that space instead of having the figure involved in it. Or what would happen if I just do an image with blues and yellows or something, trying to think of these like strange combinations. So there's some sort of a challenge involved, I would say, that draws me into the process of creating. And I think layering is something that I've been really fascinated by recently, in terms of trying to think about the ways in which oil paint is layered and creates depth, but playing around with that in not always a completely believable way. So for instance, I will, in some of these canvases, do sort of a very loose wash on the first layer, and then do some pure glazes on a subsequent layer, and then do more kind of opaque passages over part of that. And so really playing with surface and layering and color, which I feel like as a painter are the things that we experience on such a intimate but physical. And usually when I try to tell like non-artists about those things, they're like,
yeah, you get the kind of like blank stare or like, I understand the words that are coming out of your mouth, but I don't really get it.
Yeah. Well, like we went to, I taught a study abroad course a couple semesters ago, and we went to Italy, and there's a piece by, I think it was a Da Vinci piece. I can't try to remember the museum. They all blur together at this point because you're just exposed to so many.
Yeah.
Every room is like, oh my God, that's a piece I've wanted to see my entire life. Oh, next to another piece I've wanted to see my entire life.
Right.
But seeing a lot of these classic works up close, you really can tell about the layering and sort of the presence that the physical paintings have, as opposed to the mere like digital reproductions that we see on our iPhones.
Yeah.
And so that's something that continues to fascinate me now, is how can I make a painting that is really engaging to look at physically, like in person? How can I play with those layers and glazing and color to create depth in those ways? And so there was like this Da Vinci painting that, was like an unfinished underpainting. I'm trying to remember the name of the canvas at the time, what it was, but I was just like so fascinated by looking at it and being able to see traces of process in it. And, you start to like, retrace the marks on the canvas and think, oh, we must have done this first. And then, oh, maybe he did this. In the same way, I try, and the thing about this in my work is like how I can include elements of that backstory almost. Like, oh, see the pencil marks underneath that glaze. And then there's this wash on top of that. That if, an art sleuth.
Yeah, that you just like, as an artist, you love that.
Be able to like retrace my steps and it's the weird narratives we make in our heads while we work. What else we think about while we're staring at a painting for hours upon hours?
No kidding.
Besides listening to great podcasts like this one.
Thank you. I'm curious, what memorable responses have you had to your work?
Memorable responses. Mostly positive. A lot of times people will tell me personal stories about things that relate to the imagery and the work, especially the Western work.
Like flashbacks to third grade and building cereal box maquettes.
There's that. There's also, there would be, oh, have you seen this film? Or did you know this actor? He was in this movie. And those are kind of things where, people tell me, oh, I used to watch these with my dad. And so a lot of like responses that affected them. It seems like it recalled personal memories for them, which I'm totally fine with. I think that's kind of something I'm interested in, is the nostalgic quality of these images. But I haven't had too many like really strong negative responses. Usually within, I guess, those kind of responses and dialogues, you get such a different kind of conversation in different places. So like, at the opening reception of a show, there's a lot more casual conversations, but yet I think of like the conversations I had about my work in school were like way more, like critical and like.
So you're not getting, I think that's a good thing though. You're not getting those harsh critiques of what exactly are you doing here, Jason?
Yeah. I'm always really surprised though that sometimes the level of time that people spend looking at the work, and people have a lot of really great questions about the work, that I wouldn't have always thought about. And that's, I feel like for me, one of the most interesting aspects of talking to people about your work is they have such wildly different ideas.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, I love that stuff when somebody sees your work, because it's kind of like, painting to me is a lot kind of like music is, in the sense that you create this piece and you put it out into the world. And once you let it go, once it's out there, it's no longer yours, really. It's now a conversation between the viewer and your painting. And, when we're lucky, we get to witness that and we get to hear those types of questions or comments that you're referring to.
This episode is sponsored by Cytacki Art Supplies. Cytacki has always made it a point to get to know the artists who use their brushes. So I wanted to talk to a few of those artists.
My name is Greg Crayola-Simpkins. I'm an artist. I've been working with Cytacki for, it feels like 12 years. I forget the exact amount.
Cytacki had gone out to see Greg at his studio to learn how he uses his brushes. They were doing a little research and development to kind of improve their line.
A lot of the brushes I was using, I would damage them pretty hard because, I worked pretty hard with the acrylics, and then they wouldn't spring back fast. And I noticed that Cytacki brushes, they held up longer, and I was like, well, that's really cool.
They ended up developing a relationship, and pretty soon
they're like, would you like your own set of brushes? I was like, oh my gosh, that'd be amazing. It's like a skateboarder getting his own skateboard, right?
I wanted to hear it straight from Greg, Cytacki's first pro team member, and we'll talk about what that means in another episode. But what I wanted to know was what makes Cytacki so different from other brands of brushes that he's used.
They held their point better. I don't know if it's because when I have gone up there and watched them make the brushes, it's all in house right there. You just see the care that they hand make each one. So you can just see that they put a lot of love into making their brushes, and it comes out when you're painting.
What are some of the questions people ask you about your work that just either you just didn't expect, or you never saw it that way, or you were surprised that they noticed it?
I don't know. I'm drawing a blank on any really good responses. Either that or I just blacked them out because I was too embarrassed. I'm usually, like I said, just surprised at sort of the level of engagement that people have in terms of what they recognize that actor, or they recognize that place. I'll think about it. There'll probably be something in there.
Yeah, I'm just curious if there's anything specific that stands out. But I'm also curious too. So let me just preface this for you by saying that the reason that I asked this question is because the people who listen to this podcast are artists, and a lot of them, the most common response I get from this podcast is something along the lines of, wow, when so-and-so said XYZ, it meant so much to me because I'm in my studio all by myself, and I thought I was the only person who thought that or noticed that or whatever, or had that happen to them. So hearing that from another artist means a lot to me. So the question I want to ask you is, what have been some of the biggest challenges that you've faced or setbacks during the course of your career as an artist? And most importantly, what did you take away from the experience?
I think the biggest setback I kind of faced was a couple years after I graduated and moved to where I am now, and have been working for a couple years and trying to decide about sort of the direction I wanted to go with my work. I felt like I had been doing a similar kind of work for a while, and I wanted to kind of branch out a little bit, but I kind of just got this horrible case of artist block, which, I had never experienced anything like that. I thought that was like such a stupid idea. Like, what do you mean? And I think, in retrospect, looking back, it's not necessarily that I didn't know what to do. It's just I wasn't sure what I wanted to do in terms of, I had been in school for so long that I constantly had a support system of feedback of people telling you, well, I really like this, this one's really great. This, I'm not so thrilled with that one. That once that sort of support system disappeared and I was trying to figure out sort of, I wasn't in, I didn't have a project that I had to do. I was like, oh, I wanted to, plus, okay, so let me also say that I was making a lot of the Western work in Indiana. We talked about conversations that when I talked to people about that work, it resonated in a much different way because it wasn't so local. I mean, Oklahoma isn't like the West per se. We don't have, mountain ranges and things, but Western culture is a much stronger part of
interesting. Yeah.
Identity here, that when we moved here, Western landscapes are just so ubiquitous everywhere that, it just seemed like people were catching the like critical aspect I was trying to take about these ideas. And, I was painting these famous movie star cowboys, but I was doing a lot of appropriating images, but trying to really mess with how I painted it to convey, some ideas and things. And it just was, it seemed like it was just getting kind of lost within like, oh, there's another painting of a cowboy. So like in retrospect, I feel like I should have embraced that and, played up more of this kind of subversive thing I was doing. Instead, I was like, oh, I want to do something different. That was my chance to do something really interesting.
So did you feel like you wanted to change because you were now in Oklahoma and you felt like people like, in a way, like not getting the joke, but just because you're in a, kind of outside of that?
Yeah, I think so to a certain degree. I also think it was just adjusting to a new place and a new job and, and having complete control of what I wanted to do. And so, as I was working on those last projects, I had all these ideas of other things I wanted to do. And then I think I started overthinking everything, the manner where I'm one of those people that I feel that I can have the potential to overanalyze a situation.
What? An artist do that? Are you kidding me?
I know. And so I just started like overanalyzing everything about my practice. Like, should these be representational? Should I do this? I'd make a list and list. And it was a really frustrating period because it felt like you weren't really moving forward. You were just kind of spinning your wheels. And because I was being so indecisive about what I wanted to do.
How did you pull yourself out of that?
Well, I mentioned support systems. And so my biggest support system would be my wife, who is also an artist. And she was really helpful at, being encouraging and just saying like, you just need to make stuff. You just need to go in the studio, make some decisions, you're going to make some crap and that's fine. Make some crap. You'll work through your ideas. And, eventually I did. I would go into the studio and just draw and make some images. And, some of it was terrible. Some of it was good. Some of it was in between. But it was like, oh yeah, this is what I tell my students to do. This is what I
logically know that I need to do. And yet,
yeah, it's that gap between like logic and, when you engage in responding emotionally to your work often or overanalyzing it, that once I started doing that, once I got back into like getting my hands involved in the process and putting down the pen and stop writing and overthinking everything and just start making, then of course, like you would expect, it's like, oh yeah, this idea connects to this idea, and then of course, it starts to pick up and you have a million ideas. And so, yeah, I think the advice of how I dealt with that was by just working and trying to turn off that switch that is over being too critical too early. And it's like, I look at my students and I often see that happen to them where they're developing something, they're working on a painting or a drawing, and like I see so much potential, what's going to become of that, and all they can see is what it is right now. They can only see like, well, the chin's a little too small, and like I don't think the color choices are that great. Yeah, and I'm thinking, forget the chin. what about this juxtaposition you have going here? Like, this is really cool stuff, you know?
Right.
That forward thinking versus like just being stuck in analyzing what you're doing at that time.
Yeah, it's like, I think we're so prone to that as artists. And it's, I mean, I think artists as human beings, whatever, but we get so, it's the analysis paralysis in a way that like we get so wrapped up in wanting that crystal ball or wanting those signs along the road so that you have zero doubt that you're on the right path and that either this series or this particular painting is going to turn out well. So like you start to do what you describe, which is the overthinking part of it. And I think there's a certain piece to it that you just have to let go and be okay with making bad paintings or making mistakes. And I think most people intellectually know that. I don't think that that's a newsflash to anybody, but sometimes it's just hard to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. There's a great article I have my students read too that's talking about this like idea of the bus. It's like they call it the bus theory or something, where it's like, you know, you get on a bus and you drive a little bit and then you get off because the bus doesn't seem like it's going the right place. You get on another bus, you're going to be riding buses forever, but you just got to stick on that one bus and eventually it takes you to where you want to go. And I think that's so true with like when you're starting a new project or you're in that creative space where you, like you said, the analysis paralysis, where you're like, oh, this isn't working. I need to scrap it and try something different. That it really is just the grunt work of making something that's not necessarily perfect or great, but it's going to lead you to the next stop and then lead you to the next stop along the line. And you know, eventually it's going to get to some place that's interesting. It's like really hard to avoid that happening if you do those things, if you keep working at it, keep making incremental changes from drawing your piece to piece, that it's going to take you somewhere, just as long as you stick around for it, I guess.
Yeah, I like the way that I often describe it is it's kind of like compounding interest, you know, that whole, if you think about it in terms of your ideas, if you're just adding a little bit to it every day and sticking with it, you learn and grow so much more than if you're like jumping ship every chance you get or jumping to the next bus, like you're saying. Like if you, what is it? There's the old, it's like some formula that that people always tell you about saving when you're a kid or something, or it's been in a million articles, but the idea of you get 1 penny and then every day it doubles for 30 days. Would you rather, I think the question is something like, would you rather have 1 penny that doubles every single day for 30 days or $1 million? And most people will answer $1 million, but like having a penny that doubles every day is worth, I can't remember. Somebody do the math for me. A lot more. And so I think the same is true with your ideas and your paintings, that when you stick with the concept and you're just slightly improving it every single day, your learning from that is exponential. But it's tough.
Yeah.
So much easier said than done. And it's so easy to see that in somebody else than it is to see it in yourself. And I think no matter where you're at, like at some point, we all fall prey to that, it seems.
I think that's why it's so important to continue to have those like that external perspective on your work, that often I think that's when artists, you know, come into problems, is when we're so wrapped up in what we're doing that we're so wrapped up in our own mind too, that it's hard for us to just see clearly what we're doing. And I feel like we all often need that somewhat of a reality check of like, this is what I'm doing. Am I doing that? Yeah, you're doing that. Or, well, I don't know. And I mean, that's what my wife and I have these conversations all the time. And it's so fruitful because it just feels like it helps me see so much more clearly what I'm doing, even than when I'm in my head or just trying to figure out it all up there. External perspective that can look at it objectively. Huge.
And it just seems like not a big deal until you don't have it and you've been just spent 6 months in that state of mind that you're talking about. I'm curious, aside from your wife, do you have other people that you show your work to? Like, how do you decide who to get opinions from?
Well, there's a bunch of other great faculty members here that we have some informal conversations about the work, and I work with a lot of graduate students here. We often have some casual conversations about my work. I'll bring them into my studio and show them what I'm working on, and then of course, when you're exhibiting your work and that interaction you have with the public. So I kind of liked to think of there's multiple voices and different types of opinions, and some you trust more than others, and some you value, and some that are great, but you learn to filter.
Yeah, I mean, you need outside opinions, but at the same time, you have to have your own opinion and be able to, filter, curate, decide what advice you're going to take, because if you take everybody's advice, you're like a boat without a sail, and you're just drifting all over the place back and forth. I love this question because it usually introduces me to other artists. If you could own a piece of art by any living artist, what would it be, or whose?
Any living artist. I'm going to have to say that I would love to own a piece by, I mentioned her earlier, my graduate school mentor, Maria Tomasula, who is an artist who she shows in Chicago and in New York. She just does these wonderful, very smooth and just so delicate paintings. They're just luscious in terms of their color, and they're sensuous, and they're just gorgeous compositions that I wouldn't mind having one of those on one or two of my walls.
Is there a single habit that you think contributes largely to your success as an artist?
Besides lots of coffee and whiskey and balance, right?
Depends on what time of day you're doing that, I think.
Right. I think it's mostly, it sounds cliche, but I think it is kind of what we talked about in terms of when I was talking about having a setback. It's just hard work and persistence that I think most of the problems we encounter can often be solved through just persistence and continuing on the daily practice of being an artist. That it's never, for the most part, it's never been a moment where a lightning bolt strikes me and I have this amazing idea fully formed and I can go out and make a work of art in a couple of days, and I can sit back then for the next couple of months and feel satisfied. It's like, like you mentioned, this compounding interest. The magic happens when you work at it, and that it's not this romantic view of inspiration and success that, on a conceptual level of like my ideas, on a formal level of like the making the paintings, and even on like the business side of things, that it just takes that daily commitment and decision to continue working and, being smart about it and managing your time and all of those characteristics that make for a successful human being. Mm-hmm. But I really think it is, for me, that it's been continuing just on, like I said, a weekly, day-to-day, monthly basis, working hard, trying to squeeze in studio time whenever you can, and letting things happen to a certain degree.
Nice. One last question. It's a quick question, but your answer doesn't have to be quick. What would your perfect day look like? Like, how would your ideal day, what would it look like?
Well, it would start with a nice breakfast. I'd sleep in, first of all.
What's sleeping in for you? Because you have young children, so.
Well, the toddler's starting to, well, he's 3, so I don't know if that's a toddler anymore, but he started to sleep in a little bit more. Used to be, there's a period where it was like 6 a.m. He'd be like ready to go in the morning. Hey, Dad.
Just jumping on the bed.
So sleep in, maybe get up around 8 o'clock, have some pancakes and bacon, a nice cup of coffee, then maybe go work in the studio for a little bit, and have some lunch and spend some time with my kids, work some more, and maybe spend some time with my wife and kids some more. I don't know. I feel like it's a balance. Like, as the role and lifestyle of an artist is something that is also like never what I expected. And it's like so wonderful in some ways and so like crazy in others, because your days, day-to-day life varies. It always is so different. Like, it's so flexible in a certain way that's like, some days I'll spend hours in the studio, like, really long studio days. And then other days will be like other weeks where, I'm doing my day job at school, teaching and committee work and delivering art or doing all these other things that, life demands. And then other days where it's like you get 10 minutes here to do something and another.
And it goes in phases too. Like your whole, like it shifts as like, I feel like everything changes every, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. It's completely different.
I bet. Yeah. I mean, it seems like, we were just talking the other night and it's like, is this like level of busyness normal, or is this like, we're really busy right now, or is this just kind of normal? And it's like, I think this is kind of normal. It's hard to tell. Yeah. There's something great about having that flexibility that each day is so different.
Yeah.
That some days you can be engaged, like really creative side of you. And some days, I can come to class and be the professorial academic type and be able to talk to my students about their work, and I have to worry about all the problems or the fun things I'm working on in the studio. And
it's a nice break sometimes.
Yeah, and having flexibility too, that I can spend time with my family and be able to do things that like a strict 9-to-5 job doesn't offer. But on the opposite side, there's something nice about having that, sharp distinction of like work and life. Whereas I feel like with artists, there's typically some sort of an overlap between life and work, and we define ourselves through our work to a certain degree. So for better or for worse, it is us in a way.
Yeah. It's like, to me, it's so tightly interwoven.
Mm-hmm.
We're observers and we're makers. And so you can't turn that off. Like, we have to be so observant, I think, in order to create. Yeah. Just to create, I was going to say to create great art, but
yeah,
but just to create. And so that's not something you can necessarily turn off. Like, there's just I think there's a heightened state of awareness that's pretty constant. And yeah, it can be exhausting, but it's also just fascinating. It's like you're just awake and watching everything and seeing everything, and it somehow, some way is going to weave itself into your work.
Yeah, it's a rewarding way of looking at the world that I find to be really interesting and a fun way to exist, I suppose. I was just thinking how, like, you said on a daily basis, you just encounter things like, oh, I could think about that with my work. But like, if I look back at the pictures on my phone, it's like, there's all these, I have like tons of like random screenshots of things. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I love that color combination. Or like, what if I incorporate squirrels? And I don't know, like, it's a random image that you're like, you look back and like, why did I take that picture?
What was I thinking?
Around too, the random things that you think about or connect with that some way will like make their way back into the studio at some point. And you never know when those things are going to happen. And you do sort of jump between whatever you're doing and sort of that other future time where you'll be in the studio, and how that will find its way in there in some way or another.
Yeah. And connecting, like you kind of mentioned earlier, just connecting all the dots. And I don't know, when you can connect these random things, it becomes so much more interesting. Like when you do make those random leaps, or what seems to be random leaps, I think if you had a recording of your brain and your thought process, they wouldn't feel so random after all. Like, it's kind of like that. We used to play a game when I was a kid in school, and it was like just going off on tangents. Like, it was literally like okay, here's a toy. What does that make you think of? Oh, that makes me the truck. It's a little blue truck. Blue makes me think of the sky. Okay, what does the sky make you think of? And you just go on, like you're just trying to, like, I'm sure they were trying to foster creativity and non-sequential thinking, which seems like you wouldn't really have to foster in kids, but I guess, whatever. I went to a strange school. But I think, those are the types of things as artists that are just, I don't know, it's so cool and it's so fun. And when you can like make those, what seems like bizarre connections, but they somehow make sense, you're just like, oh my God, this is so fun.
Yeah. And those are often the most interesting kind of connections too, that I find that like often when I sit down with like a sketch pad and try and force myself to think of something, it just often feels really contrived. But, if you're like out and you see something that reminds you of something you're working on, those are like the most interesting connections that happen. Like my recent work, I was talking to a student, we were looking at these Chinese landscapes, these brush and ink landscapes. And, I was thinking about those and I was like, this seems like really relevant. So then of course, I get the books I'm reading about it. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, this is totally really relevant to what I'm working on. And so it's like, that would never have happened if that conversation didn't happen.
Yes.
It wasn't like I would have ever arrived at that point by just sitting with a blank piece of paper and writing. That you have to actually get out and engage with the world and engage with all kinds of stuff. That it's usually, that case was kind of art influencing thing, but it's typically the most interesting stuff comes from engaging outside of the canvas or outside of, art books and engaging with the world and people in it. And gosh, that sounds very like lofty.
Well, there's that saying that art imitates life, but in order for that to happen, you have to have a life.
Right.
So maybe it's not so lofty after all. You're reminding me, I've probably talked about, I don't know why I love this book so much, but again, it's a book that has nothing to do with art. It's called The Pinball Effect. And it's kind of about what you just talked about. And it sort of traces all these major and sometimes minor inventions that came about when the person wasn't really thinking about it at all. So it sort of implies that randomness and that chance that you were just talking about. At least in the book, they're making the argument that when you're trying so hard to solve a problem and you're so completely focused on something, going back to what we were talking about before that happens with the artist, the analysis paralysis or whatever, it's also sort of like you can't see the forest for the trees. And you're trying so hard to solve this problem that you almost can't solve it because you just have to let I don't know if your subconscious mind, but you just have to let it percolate. And so all these different inventors effectively like either had pretty much given up on the thing they were trying to invent or just were taking a break from it and, like often going out for a walk or something. And then they would say, like the famous Ben Franklin with the kite flying, like things like that they were just, taking a break, not thinking about it. But the hypothesis, at least of this book, is that your subconscious mind is still trying to solve the problem. And so because your conscious mind isn't trying to do it, then you can make those leaps because all of a sudden you see something and your subconscious mind was still trying to solve the problem. And then that like key fits into the hole.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And all of a sudden it's just like, you have that eureka moment. So I think, I think there's definitely something to that. And I think as artists, like if we just lock ourselves in the studio because we think that we're going to get more work done that way, I think it's again, one of those things that logically we know it's not true. But I think a lot of people, including myself, try to do that. And then you have to just like say, all right, enough, and go out and live your life and, go experience something. And then all of a sudden you have that flash.
Definitely. Completely 100% agree with that.
Very cool. It's very fun being an artist for that reason, I think. But anyway, so Jason, thank you so much for talking with me and sharing your stories. I enjoyed it a lot. And thank you also to Jen Malone for letting me know about Jason's work.
All right. Yeah, great. Thanks so much.
Thank you again to Jason for sharing his insights with us. Go to savvypainter.com for the show notes on this episode. You can see images of Jason's work and get links to see the work of the artists mentioned in this show. I totally agree with my friend Jen. You have to see those paintings from the series See the USA. They are fantastic, as is the rest of Jason's work. One more thing I want to let you know. This year, you can expect a lot more workshops from Savvy Painter. If you are an artist who struggles with getting painting time in or feels like you're always busy but never really moving forward with your art, then my workshops just might interest you. Past workshops include Mindset Mastery, a 5-week online workshop to help you get past the roadblocks that keep you from painting. In it, we tackle the inner critic, fears of artists, and setting yourself up for a successful creative day. The workshop, How to Develop a Relationship with the Right Gallery, helped several artists find the right gallery and show their work. So if this is something that interests you, you can go to savvypainter.com/workshop and get on the email list. This is separate from the main list that tells you when a new episode comes out. This is just for the workshop, so you don't get quite as many emails, but when you do, there's always something really good happening. Sign up now and get a downloadable PDF with case studies that tell you exactly how 3 artists pushed through barriers that were getting in the way of their studio time. You can, for example, learn how Rhonda went from not wanting to call herself an artist to getting her very first solo show. Also, listen to an introverted artist describe how she built her confidence and then spoke in front of an audience of her peers. And you can discover the tools that Samantha used to take back her power after a decade of believing that she had no, I'm putting air quotes there, she had no talent. So again, go to savvypainter.com/workshop to reserve your place on the list. When you sign up, you get that downloadable case studies that I mentioned, but more importantly, you get exclusive invites to upcoming workshops. Most of the time when I launch a new program, it sells out before I ever announce it publicly. So reserve your spot now at savvypainter.com/workshop. Until next week, this is Antrese Wood with the Savvy Painter Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.